hi everyone, you're very welcome to tonight's training on GDPR and data protection. This training is part of the Social Enterprise Policy Bank, which is a project that's being run by 3 local development companies: Monaghan Integrated Development, Louth Leader Partnership, and Cavan County Local Development. And they're doing it in partnership with a charity called Quality Matters. In tonight's training on GDPR data protection, we're going to cover these 4 key points. We're going to talk about what is the history and importance of GDPR. And for those of you who may be aware, in the last number of years, there's been some pretty significant changes in relation to GDPR. So we're going to cover a little bit what those changes mean and what the implications were for organizations. We'll talk about some of the basic elements of GDPR. What are the principles, the rights for individuals and users who are accessing your organization. We'll talk about some of the key procedures and processes that really do involve your organization and its work. Thirdly, we'll talk about GDPR and data protection, how it really applies to your organization. More specifically, we're going to look at really what are a policy template that's been developed that your organization can use. And we'll really focus on some of the key processes inside that policy that you need to be aware of and that may have, I suppose, an effect, for how your organization undertakes its work. And fourthly, we're going to really sort of identify what might be some potential gaps in your data security and what are some actions or responses to help manage these. And we're going to talk about these in broad terms. We're not necessarily going to be asking anyone to kind of announce that they have a gap in their organization, but we'll talk about some of the kind of common kind of issues or maybe common challenges that occur for organizations, and we'll talk about what are some good practice and some solutions for managing them into the future. The policy template that we're about to show is a Word document that we would have emailed to each of the participants earlier today. So you should have that already in an email. If you don't, during one of the breaks during today's training session, you can let me know and I'll make sure that's emailed to you right away. But in just a moment, I'll do is I'll open that Word document up so you can see exactly how it's been designed, and I'll talk broadly about the different sections in it. The document itself is 11 sections. It has 7 different appendices, so there's a lot of different information in this. It's quite comprehensive. You'll see there's 2 different sets of colors used in the document. Some black, which is just your normal text for the website, but it's really important we highlight the red text, because the red text is what you'll be reviewing and making changes to that are appropriate to your organization. So let's go through the policy right now. We're going to have a quick overview of what the content of that policy is. I'm going to discuss some of the important and relevant sections for your organization. And I'll also just highlight a good example as to where you can make changes to some of the red text that appears in the guidebook. So I'm going to just turn it on right now. You should see the kind of policy template now here on your website, on your screen. So this is the data protection policy. You'll see on the front page is our first example of where there's some red text. So this is just text that you can change. Here you can explain what was the date that your policy was approved by your board or committee. What is the date for the next review of this policy, and whose the responsibility is it to kind of review that? Like I said, the policy itself is separated into 11 different sections. And it covers a lot of the detail that we'll be discussing also in tonight's training. So we'll talk about the role of a data protection officer or liaison. We'll talk about principles, the purposes, and the different types of data that are used in organizations. One of the questions that was asked at the start is around the storage and the retention of that data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a number of different appendices, and these appendices are also referenced throughout the different policy. And one of the things that may be quite useful, for instance, is something like this appendix on what are some of the different key terms and definitions that are used. It's a quick reference guide because data protection in particular has a lot of terminology that's used. And sometimes those terms are not used universally in the same way across our sector. So when you're reading through the policy, if there's anything that is a little bit confusing or jumps out as being kind of unusual, hopefully an appendix like this will be very useful for kind of really trying to understand exactly what's being referred to. In the document itself, what we've done is kind of put a couple different terms that your organization can like it's red text, but it's really, we've used language throughout that will make it possible for you to kind of replace these words and substitute it with your own organization's name. So for example, company name is a term you'll see throughout the training, throughout the policy. And there's different sections where you'll see the word company name kind of used periodically. And in it, what you could do to make your life a lot easier is simply go to kind of in your kind of Microsoft Word is kind of replace the word company name with, say, our organization is called Quality Matters, and you kind of can replace all. Those are just quick ways, I suppose, for your organization to kind of modify this document. Another example, I suppose, of where this red text has been used is actually the second section here about a data protection officer, a liaison. And I actually want to use this opportunity briefly to really highlight what the differences are. So in legislation, a data protection officer is a very specific role, and not every company requires a data protection officer. In our experiences, sometimes the term data protection officer is used quite casually to refer to someone in an organization who has a remit or responsibility for data protection issues. But it's really important to highlight that it is a very specific role in the view of the Data Protection Commission, which is the kind of agency here in Ireland that's really responsible for issues and data breaches and ensuring that there's kind of compliance with kind of the data protection regulation here in Ireland. So if you're kind of curious if your organization needs a DPO, a data protection officer, we've got a little footnote here with some brief advice and suggestions to help you kind of discern whether you need a DPO or not. More often enough, organizations probably what they will need instead of a DPO is a data protection liaison, and that's why we've kind of structured this section like this. So a data protection liaison is a first point of contact for your clients, for your service users, for your customers who want to make requests to access any of the personal data that's being recorded by your organization. They really act as the liaison person as well between your organization and the Data Protection Commission in any circumstances or any instances where there might be a breach. And my colleague Maria later in this training will talk to you about what is a breach and when do you need to contact the Data Protection Commission. But in an instance like this, if your organization doesn't need a data protection officer, it's more likely you'll need a data protection liaison. All you would need to do is just take this section, delete it from the document, and you can just take that information and just update it. So Philip Izard with, senior project specialist. That's my title in my organization. And what you've done right there is you've done exactly what the template was designed to do. You've kind of been able to kind of quickly modify the document and make it your own for your organization.
I suppose those of us that are here are familiar with GDPR to a certain degree. I can see from the kind of organizations that you're running that there are different levels of understanding about what GDPR means for you. But the reality, I suppose, of GDPR is that it has the same consequences for all of us. So it's kind of outlined better. It came in 2018. It's an EU policy, and it's something that we all have to adhere to. It makes privacy and data protection a human right in a way that it wasn't previously. It's created the Data Protection Commissioners in Ireland, which is the supervisory body that watches what organizations do to ensure that they're compliant with the GDPR. And it created those kind of data protection officers on kind of a statutory scale. What it's also done is that the consequences, I suppose, for data breaches, which, previously there were data breaches. And I guess they weren't treated with any kind of structure. Whereas now, you know, the consequences are quite significant in that if you have a data breach, there is a potential that at least, you know, 4% of your annual turnover or 20 million, and usually whichever is the larger number, you will have to pay over to the Data Protection Commission. And that individuals whose data protection rights, whose data has been breached, have a right to be compensated for any consequences that are negative in relation to their data being breached. And I suppose the really interesting thing to say is that, you know, regardless of whether or not you are registered as a charity, regardless of or whether or not your company structure, or whether or not you are the governance code for charities, GDPR applies equally. It doesn't matter if you're a charity or a private company, you have to adhere to GDPR, okay? There's no kind of way around it. There's no loopholes for smaller organizations. You just have to make sure that you're doing what GDPR asks you to do. The other interesting thing about GDPR, which is really, really important, is that you aren't just responsible for being compliant, you are responsible for demonstrating that you're compliant. And that's one of the key factors of GDPR. So it's not okay, I suppose, to be able to say, yeah, we understand GDPR, we protect people's rights, here's our policy. But you also need to be able to prove, if asked by the Data Protection Commissioner to do so, exactly how you do that. What does your filing system look like? What do your staff know about how to use that filing system and protect other people's data? So the most important thing, a bit like the governance code for those of you that are registered charities, is it's all about demonstrating how you are adhering to what is a statutory obligation. So there are several principles that GDPR in particular has outlined for us that we have to adhere to. And most of them are actually really common sense principles. And most of them are things that we would all do anyway, you know, because we respect the information of the people that use our services and we know that they are trusting us with their personal information. So what we do need to make sure is that, a little bit like Finbar pointed out earlier, when we are taking information on our service users, that we are only taking the information that we need to, and that we are doing so with explicit consent. That doesn't mean that I'm sitting down and having, you know, a brief conversation and are you happy for me to use your information? That means that I have a form that I'm asking you to sign that tells you what information I want, why I want it, why it's important for me to have this information, and what it means for you, for me to have this information, and how I'm going to store it. And also, like Philip said, we're only going to, or Finbar rather, we're only going to keep it for the period in which we need it. Now, there's some information that we can hold on to for longer. Medical information we need to hold on to for 20 years. But as Finbar pointed out, and I will talk about it a little bit later, is when we remove the identity of the people, and their information is no longer traceable back to them as individuals, we can keep that information indefinitely. So I suppose, Finbar, obviously you guys, you're doing absolutely the right thing. Again, so the principles that I suppose are far more important too is that we have an obligation as organizations to ensure that the information that we have on the people who uses our services is always adequate, it's always relevant, and it's always accurate. So hello? Oh, so sorry, I thought somebody was speaking there. So we have to make sure, obviously, that we are maintaining the information in a way that it is accurate and that the service users can be confident in that. So the number of principles, there's 7 of them, and we are, I wonder if Betty can hear us and turn off her camera, possibly, or turn off her sound. Okay. Anyway, we have to ensure that it's processed appropriately and that we are secure in how we are processing that data. Now, that will change irrespective of how we process the data. Do we use electronic systems? Are we using hard copy files? And there's a big difference between how we can make information secure depending upon how we are going to store it, which I'll also be going into later. Now, what the GDPR does is clarify for us what is personal data. And personal data relates to, obviously, some of the fairly obvious stuff: my name, my date of birth, my email address, my Facebook ID, anything that can be tracked back to me as an individual. Then what we also have in GDPR is special category data. And special category data relates to information that the GDPR recognizes that could cause potential harm if it is released about us. And it just has a stricter kind of need to be protected, such as our medical information. I mean, such as our blood type, our trade union membership, our criminal records, because there is still obviously stigma attached to certain things. And while the Equal Status Act has kind of allowed for us to feel more secure about not being discriminated against, the GDPR actually does so in a completely different way. And that's what's wonderful about GDPR. As much as it can be a difficult one to read and maybe has increased what we have to do in the workplace, GDPR also helps ensure that our right not to be stigmatized by some of the personal information about us is protected, you know. So again, and I suppose what can also be relevant there is just our political beliefs, that these things aren't going to be used against us, and that they're not going to come out in an arena we are uncomfortable with, even if we do disclose them for the purposes of using your service. So again, going back to Finbar's example, once that information is anonymized, we can do certain things with it, right? So we can use that data for the purpose of statistics reports showing our funders the work we're doing with service users, as long as we aren't exposing who those service users are as individuals, you know. So 24 people were delivered a particular food item over a particular period. So you have that information, you have those statistics, but you're not actually using the names of those people, and you've destroyed them. So you're keeping your information, you're doing so in a way that is perfectly ethical and aligned with the GDPR, but you're also protecting those individuals, because in destroying kind of, I suppose, the original way you gathered those information and that name, you've no way of anybody tracking that information back to that singular individual, if that makes sense. And hopefully it does. So the other thing that special category data does, and criminal history is a really good example for special category data, right? Criminal history is somewhat similar to the level of protection that we need to afford children and vulnerable adults. So when we are working with people whose personal information might put them at a greater level of risk, or when we are dealing with people who, through perhaps their age or their ability to I suppose understand things, might have their personal data breached, we have it's particularly protected under GDPR. We have to be even more careful. We have to prove even more so that we are doing things that ensures that they understand what we're doing with their information, and that information is protected. So again, with this criminal information data, we are making sure to stipulate why we want it. We are getting explicit consent. We're not just saying, right, you consent for us to have your information. We are asking that question, and you are going to sign a consent form, but then we are actually going to let you know that we actually also collect special category data that relates to your criminal history. Are you happy for us to do this? And get the consent for that. If a person isn't happy for you to collect that data, you don't collect it. There's no ifs, ands, and buts there. We do not collect any information we do not have consent to collect. And we don't collect it if we haven't explained to the person why we're collecting it and what we're doing with it. There are some, I suppose, exemptions to the idea of consent, which is arguably probably the most important principle within the GDPR. It is advised that, you know, when you are gathering personal data, that you display that you're doing so under a variety of kind of principles. Consent is one of them. Consent is by far the easiest one of them too, because you can demonstrate through a consent form that you have gotten that person's consent, and that you've done so in a way that's thorough. You've explained exactly what you want, why you want it, how long you're going to hold it for, and what you're going to do with it. With relation to certain things, that kind of need for consent is relieved a little bit. For example, when we are working with children and young people, when we have a mandatory obligation to report our suspicions of any kind of child abuse, under those circumstances, we have to let TUSLA know. And when we're doing so, the person who discloses the information, whether or not it is a child or an adult, we do not need their consent to breach their confidentiality and share their identifying information, names, addresses, etc., because we have that mandatory obligation to protect a child. So if we breach somebody's data protection rights or GDPR rights because we are genuinely doing so for a concern due to child protection issues, then we don't need to worry about their consent. Now, what we do need to do is ensure that we are only sharing what we are asked to share, and that we're not, filling out forms with unrelatable data that isn't necessary for the process. Similarly, when we are working with vulnerable adults, we do have a right to breach their data rights when it's going to keep them safe. Again, they are afforded the same, I suppose, we are afforded the same flexibility to ensure that vulnerable adults are kept safe, in that as advocates, we have a right to disclose who they are and what concerns we have about them, so long as we are working in a way that we are genuinely concerned about them. Maliciously disclosing somebody's personal data is a data breach. But when we are doing so with a genuine concern and we are acting in line with our own policies in the workplace, then this isn't an issue. The other, and some of us may never come across this, but some of us do, depending on the areas we worked in. I worked in homeless services for a long time. We can breach a person's GDPR and data protection rights if in doing so, we have a genuine belief that it might be a life-saving measure, right? So I have often worked with maybe service users who maybe didn't trust certain people and didn't want us to keep information on them. But, as part of their risk assessment, I might know that they are asthmatic, but that they might also use opiates. If I have to call emergency services, if somebody is really unwell, and I am concerned that in not sharing that information, there could be an impact on their life, I am absolutely free to share that information, which means I can share their name, I can share if I know who their next of kin is, I can share that they are asthmatic, and I can share that I have concerns because they're also an opiate user. That's not a breach of their GDPR, because my need to ensure that their life is safe is really overarching their right to have their data protected. That doesn't mean I can have a party with their personal information, and start kind of, talking to the people attending, the ambulance drivers, etc., about other facts. I only, when I have to share somebody's information, like when I'm making a child protection report to TUSLA, I'm only sharing what they need to know. I'm not going to start recording information or giving them information that is superfluous to their needs either. I suppose subsequent to that, Philip has talked to you a little bit about some of the more important terms that come up for us in GDPR, and that the GDPR kind of made new that we have to consider. One of those is the idea of the data subject. Putting it simply, the data subject is the person whose information we hold. For us, those are our service users, there are employees, there are colleagues. We might all be volunteers, but your information is still protected by GDPR. So whether or not you have employees is kind of irrelevant. The data subject is absolutely anybody your organization has information. It might be your contractor, it might be the company to you share payroll with. Everything that you hold information on that has an individual behind it is a data subject. And the data subject is someone to whom, if you have their name, address, email, you can trace back to them. The other kind of significant key terms would be the likes of transparency. When it comes to GDPR, transparency is really important. Transparency and accountability, right? So you're being transparent with the service user about what you're doing with their information, but you're also being transparent as a company. And by being transparent, I mean that some of you already have existing policies, and that's fantastic. That's showing that, you know, we know what GDPR is, and this is how we meet GDPR and adhere to the needs that it has created. And that in turn is also proving your accountability, okay? So in being transparent, and a company that's doing kind of GDPR right isn't afraid of being transparent. And the other thing is, we're all really, really threatened by GDPR. There's absolutely no need to be, because like, the Data Protection Commissioner understands that this is new, okay? The Data Protection Commissioner understands that small organizations don't have the kind of income and funding to work on their GDPR the way that small companies can, you know. We don't, as small companies, we don't necessarily have, you know, those targeted policy officers or data protection officers. So like, there is, unless you're doing something hugely wrong, the Data Protection Commissioners is a really great place for people to go and seek advice on how to do GDPR properly. So I suppose what I'm saying there is, never be intimidated to go to the Data Protection Commissioner and say, look, I have a question here, or are we doing it right here? The other thing I suppose that GDPR has brought to us has been the idea of the subject access request. A subject access request is almost a little bit like the Freedom of Information Act that exists. But the data subject access request is the label given to when a person approaches you or your company and asks for their records. So they can do so, a data subject can ask for their records in any way they want. You might have a policy in place that says, in order for a service user to receive, you know, copies of their information redacted, that they have to send an email on a particular form that is accessible online. You also have to, though, because we work with service users with all types of abilities and needs, if somebody phones you and asks for a copy of their data, the information that you hold on them, their data, you have to give it to them. Just because they haven't filled in the form that you provided and done it in a way that you have asked, it is still a request for information. So you aren't obliged, I suppose, to ignore it. You might have a preference for how you want people to engage with you to get their information, but regardless of that, no matter what way they come to you requesting your information, you have to give that to them. And I suppose that's a dangerous one. And what you really need to do is make sure that regardless, that there is, like Philip said, you may not need a data protection officer, most small companies don't, okay? But you will need to have named somebody publicly who is going to be the contact person. So that person should be known to all of your staff and volunteers, so that if somebody gets in touch seeking copies of their information, that everybody in the organization goes, okay, I need to go to Billy. And then Billy will follow up from there, because certain things in place that from the very moment you are contacted and the person asks for their information, you have a particular amount of time during which you have to provide that information to that person, okay? So, okay, great. So just before we took our break, we started to talk about maybe auditing our data and making sure that as an organization, we have considered the kind of data that we keep, how we keep it, and why we keep it, okay? So in Appendix 1 of the policy, which is on page 8 of the policy, we have a document that's called Types of Personal Data, right? And this is a document that we actually, as an organization, should have on file. And it's a document that's going to actually help you as an organization and your board understand how you're going to record your data and how you're going to express that to service users, right? So as a company, let's say I am a Meals on Wheels, right? So the type of personal data held by me as a Meals on Wheels company, and this is just an example. So the personal data which is held by, and again, let's say my company's name is Maria's Meals, okay? So below is just an example. But the personal data which is held by me, what do I hold in my client files, right? So I'm going to have client files. That information is going to include names, addresses, ages, dietary requirements, and I hope to God I've spelled that right. medical needs, potentially, allergies. So in going through, right, these are the types of information that I'm going to have, and I'm going to remove what's not relevant to me, all right? So in looking at the kind of information that I hold, I can start looking at how I hold onto it. So in terms of name addresses, I might have hard copy files or I might have electronic systems. So I might keep an Excel spreadsheet, and each service user might have a particular Excel sheet where I keep their name, address, their allergies, any kind of dietary requirements that they have, their ages, their family makeup, in that I know, right, I need to provide them with 5 meals and not just one for an individual homeowner. In looking at that information, I'm also going to be able to have a conversation with the people in my organization that are relevant, because not everybody needs to know this information, and that's where we need to be really, really careful too. GDPR and data protection isn't about how the organization protects information of a particular person, but it's also about how I protect that information within my organization, okay? So as somebody who, let's say, runs a Meals on Wheels, not everybody in the organization needs to know all of this information, all right? So I might have a Meals on Wheels, so I will have perhaps a van driver who needs to know their address, but that particular van driver doesn't probably need to know their ages and their allergies, okay? So we are only sharing information within our own organization on a need to know basis. So as a Meals on Wheels, I might have 10 volunteers, but not all of those volunteers are going to be giving, let's say, meals to all of those people. Somebody's going to be responsible for a particular area, let's say local area. They only need to know the information relevant to that area. So I'm not going to be sharing all of my service user information with all of my volunteers. I am going to restrict who knows what information and when. And it's really important that that particular system is also on paper to show that I have a controlled way of ensuring that only the people who need to know specific information have access to that information. So when we're going through this particular form, we're going to go through it, or maybe our senior organizers, our senior managers, or our board are going to go through and go, right, what information do we keep? How do we keep that information? Is it electronic? Is there hard files? How do we make sure that that information is safe? For example, if it's electronic, is there a drive on a computer somewhere that we have password protected? Or if we're keeping it on paper, like one or two of you are doing, is it being kept in a filing cabinet that's locked? And is the access to that particular filing cabinet limited to only 2 people? For example, let's say the senior manager and the person who is in charge when the senior manager is not around, so that the information is accessible if we need it, but it's not accessible to everyone because not everybody needs it. So at all times, we are demonstrating that information is safe and that we have a process in place that safeguards that information. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Created this policy is that we have forms here that each of you can go through. Each of these forms are in the appendices. They exist so that each of you can look at each appendices and sit down with the people who are at the top of your organization, whether or not they're paid or volunteers is irrelevant. And you will sit down and go through these appendices and you look at, right, what information did we hold? Which gets you thinking about, right, how do we hold that information? Which brings you to Appendix 2, where you start looking at, right, how long do we keep that information for? So that as you're going through the appendices, you are auditing your information as you go. And through going through these appendices, you are beginning to rationalize what information you're keeping and how you're keeping it and for how long, and for how you're keeping your service users safe. Is that all making sense?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant. And like I said, we will have an opportunity for questions again. So again, what we finally get to then is on Appendix 5, which is our data protection impact assessment. And every organization should have a data protection impact assessment. And what this data protection impact assessment does is that it's a singular place where we record what kind of information we keep, how we keep it safe, and how we have secured it for our service users, and what is the impact of us having that information. So your data protection impact assessment, as you work through the appendices of this policy, you are working up to creating the data protection impact assessment, which is more or less a risk assessment that records everything from the data you keep to how you keep it to how you destroy it. Is that clear with everybody?
Yeah, that's great.
What Philip and myself have shown you so far, which is that you're going to adapt it to your own needs by changing all of the areas that are in red. You're then going to sit down with your board and have a look at, right, what information are we keeping, to going right through to your data impact assessment and how you keep that information. So that kind of very nicely brings us back to then our, I'm just going to try and get rid of this, our lawfulness of processing, right? So in a related way, there are only a certain amount of ways that we can legally collect data, okay? And that's stuff that we are going to have to consider when we are going through our data protection impact assessment. And those means are, right, through consent. Our collecting of data is legal so long as we have consent, right? You only have to fulfill one of these lawful bases to be compliant with GDPR. However, best practice is to ensure that you're meeting two, because if you're meeting one, that's great, but if you're meeting two, your back is covered. Consent, like I said earlier, absolutely get consent. Absolutely get consent. Unless you are in one of those situations where, you know, as a life-saving measure, you're going to say to share somebody's information, get consent. Because if you have ensured that you demonstrate that your service user or your clients are very, very clear on the fact that they know what information of theirs you have, what you're doing with that information and how long you're going to have it and how you're going to destroy it, then you are fulfilling that obligation for consent. So long as you have a form that very clearly states, this is the information that we are going to hold on you, this is how we are going to keep it safe, this is when we are going to destroy it, do you give consent for us to do so? And they are signing that dotted line and dating that document, then you've covered one of the legal bases. And you are absolutely within your rights to keep that information, but you must do so in adherence to what you were saying in that consent form. So if you say, look, we are going to destroy that information in 6 months, then you must destroy that information in 6 months. If you say that you are going to destroy it when it no longer becomes relevant to the service that you provide, then you must make sure that you are destroying it when it is no longer useful. The other bases that are legal that makes you compliant to GDPR are through a contract. So if you have employees, in order to pay an employee, you have to know their bank details. You have to have their address to send them their pay slip. So therefore, you are obligated under law through contract with that employee to keep their personal information. The other side of that is that an employee can't really object to you having this information. There's no way an employee can say, no, you can't have my bank details. If that's the case, then I can't fulfill your contract and I can't really employ you. I'm sorry. Your legal obligation is another factor that you have to consider. Do you have a legal obligation to keep certain information? Yes, you do. Let's say there's a child protection concern and you're going to make a mandatory report to TUSLA. You are going to have certain information on that child, such as their name, perhaps maybe where they go to school if you don't know their address, or perhaps their address if you do know it. Therefore, there's your legal obligation. Great thing with handing information over to TUSLA, though, is that you are recording that information in an electronic form that they provide on their website, and you don't necessarily have to retain that information yourself anymore. You're handing it over to TUSLA. Is it about protecting somebody's vital interests? that's another ground that you can legally hold information on a particular person because you are protecting their vital interests. You need their information in order to do so. Is it a public task? A public task is usually more relevant, let's say, to government bodies. You know, are you providing a public task, such as like the social welfare systems, community welfare officers? They might have your information in order to ensure that you're receiving a financial benefit that's going to ensure you're not going to be hungry or go without rent. The final legal basis for which we can justify holding personal data is in somebody's legitimate interests, right? And I read it here: processing is necessary for the purpose of the legitimate interest pursued by the controller or by a third party. For example, payroll. Most of us don't have, individual accountants in our companies. We're very small organizations. We're social enterprises. You know, everything that we're doing, it's a small group of people doing it. So we might outsource our payroll to a specific company. Therefore, us sharing their information with the payroll company is the legal reason we are sharing that information. We are holding that information. Therefore, we can justify why we are doing that. So at all times when we are considering personal information, right, what is the legal basis for us having this information? The person's consented to us having it. We have to share it in order to pay them, or we have to have this information in order to ensure that we are fulfilling part of a contract, which is what we're doing when we are employing people, right? So just to kind of, I suppose, quickly review, and for me, consent is your one-stop shop. If you are gaining, you can probably hear my thoughts, don't be bold, it's the witching hour, I apologize. So in order, just a quick review of consent, because it really is the easiest one to get. It is a legal basis. So long as we are not talking about children and young people or vulnerable adults, consent is something we should absolutely always get, and there's no real reason for us not to get it. But the thing to be kind of really cognizant of when we're talking about consent is that we are getting it explicitly. We are saying, do you consent? And if so, please sign here. We aren't going to get consent for numerous things in one place. So by signing this page, you consent for us to record your information, give it to Joe Blogs so that Joe Blogs can have you paid. We are going to get explicit consent for every action that we take with that information. So do you consent for us to keep your information? Yes. No. Yes, you do. Do you consent for us to share that information with Joe Blogs? Sign here. Do you consent for us to use that information as part of our, I'm trying to think of really good examples here. Every time you are going to take an action that relates to a personal information, you are going to get consent for that. You're never going to say, right, tick this box if you give consent for us to do whatever we want with this information. You're going to give exactly what you're going to do with that information, and you're going to get that person to sign off on their consent with every action taken. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So the other really interesting thing about GDPR, and when GDPR came around, is the rights that it gave to data subjects. So as data subjects, we now have specific rights enshrined in law that as organizations, we have to ensure our service users are given, right? And again, I've kind of said this already, but these are really important things that when we are looking at developing our data protection systems as an organization, we are ensuring that the service users, the data subjects' rights are forming the basis of that, right? So when we consider the data subject and how we manage their information, we're thinking, right, are we making it known to our service users that they have a right to ensure that the data we hold on them is accurate? And is there a process in place for service users to let us know that their information has changed and they want us to update it? Have we let service users know that they have a right for us to erase their data? And have we let them know how we do that? So have we have we let service users know, let's say when we meet a service user for the first time and we have like an induction process, an induction to the organization, or how we're going to meet their needs. As part of that process, are we letting service users know that they have a right to have their information erased, let's say at a particular point or when they finish using our services, and how we do that? Have they got a right for their information to be restricted, in that we are saying to service users, right, here's the information, we're keeping it, but we're only keeping it for this specific purposes, and we are limiting it to that purpose. So we won't use your information for any other purpose other than that which we are agreeing with you right now. The other right that service users have is that their data is portable, so that let's say they go and use a different service, that we are agreeing with that service user that the information that we hold on them is transferable, that they have a right to not just request their data, but that also that information is information that we can share, should they wish for us to do so, with somebody else. And they have to wish for us to do so in order for us to share their data, and they have to sign on the dotted line that they want us to share that information with a particular person. For example, it's probably more relevant to maybe medical records and stuff like that, but we need to make sure that their information is information that we can maybe copy. If it's hard copy data, that we can copy that information and give it to them, or give it to somebody they want us to share it with. If it's electronic data, similarly, that we can download it onto a USB key or into a document and attach it to an email and share that with somebody they want us to share it with. Okay. The other thing is that they have the right to object, and this is a tough one. So service users have a right to our service, but they have a right to object to us retaining their information, right? So let's, again, an example is Meals on Wheels. We have a member of the community who's very vulnerable, who needs us to provide meals for them and has particular dietary requirements, but they absolutely, under no uncertain terms, want us to record their information. So that's when we have to start thinking about, right, how do we make sure that we know what we need to know about this person, yet we also aren't breaching their rights, their privacy rights, by retaining their information. And sometimes what the easy thing is to do is maybe to assign a number to the person instead of recording their name, and then recording everything about that person under that number, or recording their information under a pseudonym, right? So that we know who that person is, and we know, right, this particular pseudonym, Johnny Blogs, refers to this particular person who has this particular dietary need, so that we are ensuring that we know what we need to know about that person so that their dietary needs are met, and we're not exposing them to, let's say, you know, anaphylactic shock because we're giving them peanuts. But at the same time, we aren't identifying them in how we record that information. So as an organization, we need to also think about, right, what about the service user who wants our services but doesn't want to be recorded? We have to make sure that everything on file that we keep on them is not identifiable back to them, yet somehow within the organization we know who they are, so that we're protecting them. So we have to have conversations within our organization about how we're going to do that. And how we're going to do that is probably going to be specific to our organization. That's why I'm saying we have to have conversations within an organization for how we're going to meet the needs of somebody who does not want their information recorded. And the responsibility and the onus is on us to do that. Is that okay? That makes sense, you know, that we are protecting our service users. The other thing we have to be super cognizant of is that there's now a process in place stipulated by the GDPR that is supervised by the Data Protection Commissioner, that controls how we share information with service users when they ask for copies of their information. Like, we literally have a 30-day turnaround period from when a person asks for their information for when we must give it to them. Now, there are, I want to say loopholes, but that's not the right word. So long as we are engaging with the person, because there may be times where we can't feasibly give them that information within a month. So long as we are engaging with that person, we can extend the amount of time by another month. But we have to have had engaged with that person. Like from when a person requests their information to when we acknowledge that we've received that request, we only have 5 days. And the really important thing to remember is it is irrelevant when you realize when they've requested that information. The clock starts from when they request it. So if you have a system where somebody requests their information over the phone to Johnny, but Johnny doesn't let the right person know within 5 days that they need to, you know, acknowledge that, then the problem's yours. The problem is not the service users. You know, we can't say, well, that person made a request for information on Monday, but I only found out 2 weeks later. You've already breached that, because the breach then is in relation to the data subject rights, not in relation to the information. There are several ways to breach GDPR, and one of them is breaching the process by which we have to provide information to people. So you have to be really certain, right, that you have a system that records when a person asks for information, because that person has a right to be told within 5 days that you've received that. So if you, let's say you have a data protection email, so that all of your service users, if they want their information, must contact you by email. But for some reason, the person who manages that email is on holidays for 2 weeks. And all of a sudden they come back and realize that 2 weeks ago, a service user asked for their information. You've already breached their data protection rights by not responding to them within the 5 days to say that you're aware of it and that you are processing their request to receive copies of their data. So you have to, again, have a conversation as an organization for how you are going to monitor people's requests for information to ensure that you are working in line with the guidelines and timelines that the Data Protection Commissioner and the GDPR have provided, which is that 5 days to respond, 30 days to provide the information. There is no, oh God, I didn't know that. None of that. GDPR doesn't allow for us to go, oh geez, I was on holidays and I'm only after seeing this request now. No, if you're going on holidays, then there has to be somebody else who accesses that email, so that if a request comes in, that they are replying within 5 days saying, yes, I have received this, I have forwarded it to the appropriate person, and we will have your data to you by, or we need more time to organize this and get your data to you by. Okay, so the Data Protection Commission and the GDPR has allowed for certain things in responding to the data subject's rights, right? So within kind of, as an organization, if a person comes to us and asks for their data, we have that 5 days to confirm that we've received that application for their data, and that 30 day or 2 month period from which to provide that data. But there's also as an organization, if we realize we might have breached somebody's data, the onus is on us to report that we have potentially breached somebody's data. Now, listen, if you are unsure, or if you think that somebody's data has been breached, you can contact the Data Protection Commissioner. You're not in any kind of trouble if you contact them and haven't made a breach. Sure, that's wonderful. But clarifying with the Data Protection Commissioner kind of issues that maybe aren't clear to you is perfectly fine. You're not going to be punished for asking questions. In fact, they want people to do this because they want to make sure that we are doing data protection correctly. But it's really, really important that you know and that you act in accordance with the legislation provided for in the GDPR. As an organization, you only have 72 hours in order to notify the Data Protection Commissioner that you've had a data breach. Because if you don't notify them within 72 hours, you are breaching GDPR again, only in a different way. So you have to inform the Data Protection Commissioner if you suspect that you have breached somebody's data, and you have to do so within 72 hours. And then you also have to let that individual data subject know that their data has been breached. You don't create chaos, though. You must risk assess, right? If you think that there has been a breach, you sit down and you risk assess that breach, and you ask yourself, right, what information has been breached and what is the likely impact to the service user? And what is the likely impact of us telling the service user? And again, if you have any concerns, just contact the Data Protection Commissioner. They are very friendly. They want people to be doing information and GDPR properly. And so direct marketing and any kind of marketing that is electronic has its own kind of, it's governed slightly differently, and it's governed specifically by GDPR, okay? So when we're talking about direct marketing, we're talking about by post or online, and we're kind of actually talking about e-privacy really, okay? So direct marketing really comes to the fore when we are considering, I suppose, fundraising and how we manage donations. And again, when we're charities, the governance code and fundraising guidelines for charitable organizations, fundraising for public, is where we get our guidance for how we are going to manage this particular information. But we also need to look at how the GDPR wants us to manage that information, okay? So direct marketing involves when we are targeting individuals or even organizations for which we want to maybe do some fundraising or request donations. And when we're doing that, we have a specific obligation, again, to ensure that that data is protected, okay? So Philip, if you want to go to the next slide there for me, right? So direct marketing covers all of our advertising, our promotional material. If we are, for example, let's say we're just handing out leaflets in a local shop, we don't need to worry about kind of the privacy of the people we are handing that information for. We're not recording any information. Similarly, if we are just mailing out randomly, you know, information about our services or requesting donations, we don't need to worry about how we are recording that data, because we're not. But if we are, let's say, mailing out forms in which we are asking people to direct deposit or give us their bank details so that they can give us a monthly donation through their bank account, that's when we need to look at how we are doing what we're doing, and that we are ensuring that we are protecting that information that belongs to those people, right? So we are going to have systems in place where we're recording, let's say, the bank details, but we're also going to be recording the names of the individuals who are giving us our bank details. And that's special category data that we need to make sure that we are almost overprotecting, right? So we're going to keep that information. We're going to keep it in a system that secures it. And again, as an organization, we're going to be having those conversations about how we're going to keep that information, for how long, and how we're going to keep it secure. And this is one of those situations where, again, consent is really, really important. And it's not just going to be one of those tick box exercises where we are going to contact people and, are you happy for us to have copies of your bank details? Yes or no, please provide them here. We are going to be explicit about the details that we want, how we are going to maintain that information in a way that keeps it safe and secure, and for how long we're going to keep it for, and the systems we are going to use in order to keep that information. If you go to the next slide there, Philip, please, right? So again, it's kind of the point that I was making, right? So when we're talking about direct marketing, we can do those cold calls, we can just send out those requests for people to give us, you know, to sign up, to give us their bank details so that they're going to every month give us a certain amount of donations. But what we need to do, again, is be really, really explicit. So again, this means, you know, it's not going to be one of those, if you consent to do so, you do not need to reply. No, if you consent to get consent, we have to be really, really clear. We have to get the signature, we have to get the date, and we have to make sure that that person is seeing somewhere exactly what we want them to see. So you, by signing this form, you were agreeing to allow us to keep your information and use it for this specific purpose. There is no tick box. And look, similarly, this e-privacy is specifically governed, and again, it's about how we ensure the electronic systems that we use and our recording systems are protecting the information of the individuals who we get that information from. It's governed specifically by, like, the e-privacy directive, and we are currently, the EU is currently developing regulations that are going to specifically manage kind of electronic systems and e-privacy and direct marketing. But until that comes into force, right, we are currently governed by the e-privacy directive, which is governed by the GDPR at that European level. So we need to be familiarizing ourselves with that stuff. But again, the basic principle in all of this is to go back to, right, both common sense, how are we doing what we're doing and why, and have we got consent to do it? Are we being explicit? And if so, you're covering your basis. But again, that's where we go back to audit your information.